Hi all, welcome back. I'm excited to be back here and sharing another kitchen tutorial with you. I'm really excited about today's episode. It's not really holiday themed, but it is the recipe for one of my favorite foods, which is bread. Full disclosure, this is actually the second time I'm filming this. I did a tutorial for this yesterday, and then after it was finished, realized a lot of the footage was unusable. So while I wound up with a great loaf of bread, I'm retaping this for the second time, so hopefully today will be a little bit more smooth than yesterday where I had some hitches. So the ingredients that you're going to need for these, for making a loaf of bread, are pretty simple. There's a couple that you might not have, but I'll go over that in a second. First off, you're going to need sugar. If you don't have sugar for some reason, you could also use honey, flour, salt, 3 tablespoons of butter, melted but not like scorching hot, fresh off of the stove or the microwave, powdered milk, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, and then obviously yeast. Yeast is required for this recipe, it's required for bread in general. I'm going to talk a little bit about this when we're adding it to the bread, but this is one ingredient here that's non-negotiable, so make sure that you have yeast on hand. If you don't want to buy the big jar, I mean, I go through these like crazy, you can just buy the little packets. They're going to last you for a long time, and you can just use one packet at a time and not worry about it expiring. For this recipe, I'm going to give you a lot of the ingredients in both grams and cups. When it comes to the big ingredients like the bread and the water, I tend to measure in grams because it's more precise, but in case you don't have the kitchen scale, I'm going to convert all of those to cup measurements for you. So I'm going to turn my scale on. And you're going to do all of this mixing into one bowl. So the first thing that we're going to need is 300 to 340 grams of room temperature water. That translates to 1 1/4 to 1 1/2 cups. With the water, you want it to be room temperature. If it's too cold, you're not going to get it. If it's too cold, you're not going to get a lot of action from your yeast. If it's too hot, you could kill the yeast and your bread's not going to rise. So I've let this sit out for a little while. Another thing about the moisture in your bread, depending on where you live, what season it is, your flour is going to have different moisture levels. So I live in New Jersey, it's very humid, it's December and it's still pretty warm here. So I tend to go light on the amount of water that I'm putting in. If you live somewhere that's drier or you've been running your heat a lot lately, your flour's probably going to be drier and it's going to require more liquid. So I'm going to go with the lower end here. I'm going to go with just 300 grams. A little over, but it's not that big of a deal. And, sorry about that. Okay, next up is the sweetener. We're going to do 2.5 tablespoons of, where's my measure? Oh. 2.5 tablespoons of sugar. Like I said, you could use honey. You could probably use agave molasses if you wanted to, or if that was all that you had on hand. I'm just doing this with sugar today because I know that it's probably the more likely ingredient that you're going to have on hand. So that's 35 grams of honey or sugar. Just swap it out 1 to 1, or 2.5 tablespoons. Give that a quick stir, give the sugar a second to dissolve. Okay, next up is the flour. So the amount here is, let me look at my conversion here, 482 grams of flour. That translates to about 3.5 cups, but again, if you have a kitchen scale, that's gonna be a lot more precise, and it can be a little easy for your bread to turn out too dry or too moist, depending on how you measure your flour with cups. So if you do have a kitchen scale, I would highly recommend going with 482 grams. Okay, we're there. The next ingredient, there's probably a good chance you don't have on hand. It's just powdered non-fat milk. This helps your bread to be much richer, lighter, fluffier. There have been times like before COVID when everyone was stocking up on their emergency supplies where I could not find this in stores. What I was doing was just swapping out half of the water for just regular milk, again at room temperature. And I wasn't really noticing too big of a difference, but if you have powdered milk, that's ideal. So it's 35 grams of powdered milk, or 1/4 cup plus a couple tablespoons. Oh, right on the money. Come on, there we go. Butter, we're just gonna drizzle that in. And so our last two ingredients, salt and yeast, do not like each other. If you've ever watched Great British Bake Off, Paul Hollywood always says that you should put the yeast and the salt on separate sides of the bowl. I don't know if that really does anything, but I'm gonna do it just because I don't argue with Paul Hollywood. So for the yeast, it's 2 teaspoons. There's your teaspoon. I'm gonna put that to one side. And for salt, it's 1 3/4 teaspoon. I'm just gonna eyeball it. Be careful with how much salt you put in. Like I said, yeast and salt don't get along. So if you like really salty bread, you don't want to over salt it because you could keep the yeast from growing, and then your bread's not going to rise a lot. So that is all of our ingredients. First step is just going to be to give this a quick stir in our bowl. So at this stage, this is the ideal stage to really adjust the moisture content of your dough. Once you get into the kneading, it's going to be a lot harder to adjust that. So I'll show you what this should look like before we move on to our next step. So you really don't want this to look soupy, but if it's looking really sticky and tacky to the touch, you're going to want to adjust this a little bit. This is extremely, it's almost gooey. So I'm actually going to add just a tiny bit more flour. Just a little bit of a sprinkle. We can continue adding more flour once we get into the kneading, but I would like to avoid a mess on my work table. So just give this a stir for like only 1 minute. We just want to get these ingredients blended. Okay, so this should be what you're left with. I'm not really seeing any clumps of specific ingredients. It looks like it's all pretty cohesive. Now the next step is optional, but I'm gonna do it today. Something that can be helpful when it comes to kneading is to give this just a chance to set like this. It's gonna allow the flour to begin absorbing some of the water. You could technically move straight on to kneading. If you do that, the water's not gonna be quite absorbed and you're gonna have a little bit messier of a time. So I'm gonna just cover this with a towel and I'm gonna let it sit for literally just 5 or 10 minutes. And then when we come back, we'll go ahead and knead this. Oh, so this is still setting and doing its thing. But I realized I forgot to talk about the yeast that we're using. So I always use instant yeast. It's sometimes marketed as bread machine yeast. I'm not sure why. If you cannot find instant yeast, that's fine. You can just use the regular, it's like activated yeast or whatever it's called. The one difference with instant yeast is you can mix it right in the dough like I did. If you're using the regular yeast, what you're going to do is reserve some of that water, some of the sugar, stir that up in a bowl, sprinkle the yeast on top and let it kind of sit and foam for a little bit. You want to give the yeast a second to kind of activate before you mix it in with the batter. I always have great results with instant, so I would just recommend it because it's easier and faster to work with. Okay, so we're back. What? Now I have to clean my work surface again. So now we're ready to start the kneading here. So I'm gonna dust some flour on my work surface. Clean hands, clean work surface, please. Dump her out. Okay. And we're just gonna start lightly kind of patting this on the work surface. I am sure that there is some textbook correct way to knead dough, and I am also sure that I am not doing it. To be honest, with bread for me, the kneading was the part that intimidated me the most. For some people, it's working with yeast. I mean, if you follow the directions, if you follow the recipe, you're gonna be fine. But for the kneading, I always overthought, like, am I kneading it too hard? Am I not kneading it enough? Because you always worry about kneading too much flour into your dough. And honestly, at this stage, it's kind of difficult to mess up. Don't go crazy with the dough. Sorry, don't go crazy with the flour, but you're looking for your dough to be kind of squishy. This has some give to it. but you don't want it to be sticking to your kitchen counter. If you have one of these, a bench scraper, it's really useful if you're starting to get things a little too sticky. You can scrape your dough off, sprinkle a little bit more flour, and keep going. This so far is okay the way it is. But really what you're looking to do here is just kind of press on the dough. You're not looking to stretch it or tear it or really dig into it. Actually, the rougher you are with this, the more you're going to expose the interior of this dough, and you're going to let a lot of the moisture out. If it starts to get too tacky, like I said, that it sticks to the counter, you can go ahead and add a little bit more. So far we're good. As you keep going, this is going to continue to absorb that moisture, and you're going to start to get sticky spots. Just be careful with how much flour you're adding. And if your dough is, if you're feeling comfortable with how sticky your dough is, just make sure you keep any excess flour or little dried up clumps of dough out of your workspace. You don't want to be kneading that into the dough. And like I said, don't be worried about doing this perfectly. At the end of the day, whatever you wind up with, even if it isn't 100% perfect, is going to be better than what you're going to get at the grocery store, because you made it, and that makes it special, and that's what's important. So as this keeps going, it's going to become easier and easier to work with. You're going to start to feel it becoming a little bit more elastic. You can kind of start just rolling it, folding it over itself. You can, one hand, other hand. Once you get a little rhythm, you can do a dance as you're going here. And this, you want to knead it for about 10 minutes, so we have 8 minutes to go. So you can see it's kind of sticking to the countertop as I go, but it does eventually pull away. So I'm not going to add any flour. Don't be afraid if this gets a little sticky. I guess it bears mentioning that you can absolutely do this in a KitchenAid mixer. I just happen to like kneading dough, but if you want to do this in the KitchenAid, just put it, if you have a dough hook attachment, just put it in the KitchenAid for 7-8 minutes. It doesn't take quite as long in the KitchenAid because it's a little bit more abusive to the dough. 4 minutes to go. And we're done. So it's been 10 minutes. I'll show you how you know this is done. So the best way to test to make sure that this is kneaded enough is it should have a little bit of rubber to it, and that means that the gluten has been activated by your kneading. So you're going to want to just kind of keep turning this in on itself, make it into a tight ball. You should have a cute little smooth ball like this. Okay, so don't jam your finger in there. Tap it lightly, and it should bounce back. So you can see we've got some springiness. So this is fine. If you're getting to this stage and it's not really, doesn't really have a lot of elasticity, just knead it for a couple more minutes. Keep testing it, it's fine. If you want to be rather safe than sorry, go ahead and throw in an extra couple minutes. I think you're gonna have a really difficult time over kneading your bread, so it's one of those things where probably you'd be better off going overboard rather than underboard. Is that even a term, underboard? I don't know. So we're gonna take our original mixing bowl. I'm gonna scrape some of this crusty stuff out just because you don't want this getting into your bread dough. You don't gotta be crazy about this, and if you want to use a new bowl, go for it, but I hate doing dishes. So I prefer to just reuse the dishes that are already dirty. Hit it with some either butter or oil or non-stick cooking spray. Again, take your dough, baby. Make sure it's a tight ball. Plop it in. Give it a little spritz. Don't go crazy, but you don't want it to stick to whatever you cover this with. I'm going to use a towel. I hate wasting plastic. And then this is going to sit at room temperature. It's going to depend on your house. It could take an hour. It could take up to 2 hours. Again, it's pretty hot and humid here, so we're looking at like an hour tops. This actually took closer to an hour and a half. But if you take a look, You want to make sure to take a peek at it every once in a while and make sure it doesn't get too big. This is definitely doubled in size. So we're ready for the next step, which is to shape this for our loaf pan. I'm using a 9x5. Don't go any smaller because you're going to be ballooning over the sides. So we're going to go ahead and grease this quickly. We now have to shape this into a log to go into our pan for it to rise a second time. We want to get this into a log shape, but we also want it to be rolled pretty tight. If you roll this too loose, you're going to leave big pockets of air in the middle, and you're going to wind up with, I don't know if you've ever bought a loaf of bread that has a big hole through it. We want to avoid that. And also, if you make sure that the inside of this shaped log is tight, you're going to get a nice even rise. It's not going to rise more in certain places than others. So we're just going to set this out on our work surface, kind of pat it down, get all the air bubbles out. We're going to let this rise again, so don't worry, it's going to have another chance to get nice and fluffy. Shape it into a rectangle, a little bit over 8.5 by 11. I don't know, I'm terrible with measurements. I have no idea how big this is. So this is a little bit wider than our pan. That's fine, we're going to tuck the ends in. But the first step is to fold this into a little triangle. That way the inside or the center of our loaf is going to be a little bit thicker and it's going to rise into a nice dome. Fold this down and just keep rolling this up. Again, make sure that you're rolling it tight. You don't want to just flop it over itself because you're going to get a little air pocket in there. Kind of massage the ends in. Okay, we're about the size of our pan. Plop them in there. Pat this down into place. If you see any little air bubbles, just make sure you poke those out. You don't want to get like weird lumpy bubbles in your loaf of bread. I'm going to cover this with plastic wrap and it's going to sit for another hour or so. The yeast is really working its magic now, so this rise shouldn't take as long as the other one. You're looking for this to dome, to be peeking over the edge of this pan by about 1 inch. You don't want this muffin topping the entire pan because then you're going to get a weird misshapen loaf. So this will take an hour tops. Once you're about 20 minutes away, you're going to want to start preheating your oven because as soon as this is ready, we're going to pop it in. We are almost done. As you can see, this is risen at maybe a little bit more than 1 inch, but it's peeking over the edge of the loaf pan. You could pop this in the oven as is. Hey, Dexter. You could pop this in the oven as is. You could spritz it with a little bit of water first. That would help it brown. What I'm actually going to do today is coat this in sesame seeds. So the first thing I'm going to do is brush this in an egg wash. It's just 1 egg whisked together with a tablespoon or 2 of water. So I'm going to brush this pretty liberally with the egg wash. You could also, if you wanted to coat this in everything seasoning, garlic, onion, if you're using this for something savory, go for it. At this stage you can decorate this with whatever you want. Or if you want to go for kind of one of those like farmhouse old-timey loaves, you could dust this with some flour as well before you put it in. So I'm gonna sprinkle it with a lot of sesame seeds. The egg wash is really the glue here holding these in place. Don't just sprinkle sesame seeds on and bake it, they're all gonna fall off. If you're gonna do a topping, make sure you egg wash it. This is gonna go in the oven for 35 minutes on 350. My oven's already preheated. About 20 minutes in, you should check it to make sure it's not browning too much. If it is, you can just tint it with some aluminum foil lightly. I don't tend to have that problem. But again, that's 35 minutes, 20 minutes in, check to make sure it's not burning, and I'll show you what it looks like when it's done. So 35 minutes in the oven, and look at what we have. I know I just got done saying that I never have problems with my bread over browning, but sure enough, 25 minutes in, I had to tint this with some foil, but it turned out really great. There's some darkening around the edges. That's just where the egg wash pooled. That's absolutely fine. I am not going to cut into this to show you the inside because like I said, this is my second time filming, so I actually have the loaf of bread from yesterday to eat. So I'm gonna wrap this really tight in plastic and keep it in the freezer, and when I thaw it out, it'll be just like new. So thank you for watching. I hope you found this useful. And check back, I'm hoping to do videos like this about once a week. It's making a fun quarantine activity, so check back for another baking tutorial next week. Bye.